This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. There was something unsettling about the quietness of this small town in Oklahoma, as though the silence itself had the power to swallow all noise, all movement, and leave behind only a thin, suffocating layer of anticipation. It was a place where people spoke only in whispers, where their footsteps echoed like ghosts on the cracked pavement of the main street. The town was a patchwork of modest houses, low-slung businesses, and weather-beaten schools that had long ago lost their shine. There were no grand buildings here, no tall monuments or sprawling parks. Life unfolded like the slow, predictable ticks of an old clock, its rhythms comforting to some, suffocating to others. But the town's stillness had a way of pulling people in, cloaking them in the false sense that it was a sanctuary, an escape from the chaos of the outside world. The high school, an aging brick structure nestled on the outskirts of town, was no different. It sat like a hulking reminder of better days, its windows cracked, its paint chipped by years of neglect. Yet it stood, steadfast in its place, as if it were an anchor holding the town to the ground, keeping it from floating away into the vast emptiness of Oklahoma's flat plains. The students that filed in and out of its doors each day were just like the town itself, quiet, unremarkable, and easily forgotten. But beneath the surface of this apparent calmness, something more sinister was stirring, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Among the teachers was Idris Khalid, a 35-year-old man who had arrived in town 5 years ago. At first glance, there was nothing particularly striking about him. He was of average height, his skin a deep brown that contrasted sharply against the paleness of the town's predominantly white population. His eyes were dark, almost obsidian, and his face was framed by a short, neatly trimmed beard that did little to hide the exhaustion etched into his features. He was a quiet man, the kind who blended into the background, never drawing attention to himself, but whose presence was undeniable in its subtlety. Idris was a man defined by his restraint, his ability to stay in the shadows, to avoid the spotlight, to be invisible even when standing right in front of someone. To the townspeople, he was just another teacher, a foreigner, yes, but a teacher nonetheless. A man who had come to Oklahoma seeking a fresh start, perhaps an escape from whatever demons had driven him here. He was well-educated, intelligent, and diligent in his work. But he was also detached, as if his mind were always somewhere else, as if he had never truly arrived in the town at all. He lived in a small, modest apartment on the edge of the school district, and his life, outside of teaching, remained a mystery to most. No one knew much about his past, and Idris preferred it that way. The less people knew, the easier it was to stay hidden. But the town's quietness was deceiving. It was as if the very air carried a weight, a pressure that pushed down on those who were unfortunate enough to be caught beneath it. It was an oppressive stillness that made Idris feel both welcome and unwelcome at the same time. He had learned to accept the subtle looks, the polite smiles that never quite reached the eyes. He had accepted the fact that he would never truly fit in, not in a town like this, not as someone who was not born here, whose name was different from theirs, whose accent revealed his foreignness. The isolation, the distance, the constant feeling of being on the outside looking in had all begun to settle into him like a slow-growing illness. Idris had once believed that he could endure. He had told himself that he could be patient, that the town would warm to him in time, that the students would one day see past his background and accept him as just another teacher. But year after year, as the seasons came and went, nothing changed. The townspeople remained distant, polite but uninterested, and the students treated him with a quiet, condescending tolerance. His lessons were met with the occasional nod or polite clap, but there was no real connection. No one asked him questions after class. No one stayed behind to chat. No one cared to know who he really was, what had brought him to Oklahoma, what had shaped him into the man standing in front of them each day. It was as though he was invisible. The loneliness, at first a dull ache, began to gnaw at him. At night, as the darkness crept into his small apartment, the silence seemed to suffocate him, pressing in from all sides. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a clock, echoing in the otherwise empty space. It was as though time itself had slowed down, stretched thin, each second dragging on for an eternity. Idris would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day, the faces of the students who had looked at him with the same vacant disinterest. He began to feel a growing sense of resentment toward them, toward the town, toward the people who had rejected him without even knowing who he was. He was nothing more than a shadow, a figment in their eyes, easily overlooked and quickly forgotten. The whispers were the worst part. The The subtle comments that drifted from student to student, from teacher to teacher. They never said anything outright, but the undercurrents were impossible to ignore. The small town had its biases, its prejudices, and Idris was a target for all of them. There were the hushed remarks about his accent, the sideways glances when he passed by, the gossip that fluttered through the halls, just loud enough to be heard but soft enough to be dismissed. It was the kind of quiet cruelty that burrows deep inside you, a steady drip of negativity that wears down your resolve until you can no longer distinguish where the hurt begins and ends. They didn't want him here. They never had. As the years went on, the isolation grew heavier. At school, he was little more than a passing figure in the daily rhythm of the classroom. At home, in his tiny apartment, the walls seemed to close in on him more and more with each passing day. It was during these moments, when the loneliness became unbearable, that Idris began to retreat inward. He no longer saw the town as a place to belong. He saw it as a prison, a suffocating cage that held him in place, keeping him locked away from the rest of the world. The longer he stayed, the more he realized he would never be free of it, never be more than just another invisible figure in the crowd. It was in the deepest, most silent hours of the night that his thoughts began to twist. His feelings of anger, frustration, and rejection began to fester. They took on a life of their own, whispering to him, convincing him that he was justified in his hatred. He started to see the students not as children in need of education, but as symbols of everything that had been done to him. They were a reflection of the world that had closed its doors on him, of the community that had never truly accepted him, and of the cruelty that lay beneath their polite smiles. In the quiet of his apartment, the world outside became increasingly distant, like an untouchable fantasy. The town, its people, and the school, all of it began to fade into the background as his own mind spiraled deeper into a place of anger and bitterness. He felt as though he was no longer part of the town, no longer part of anything. And the silence, once comforting, now felt like the loudest, most suffocating force in his life. And then, one day, in the midst of it all, something broke. A small, insignificant moment, the kind that would have been overlooked by anyone else, became the spark that set it all in motion. The town, which had once seemed so calm, suddenly felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Idris was no longer just a teacher. He was a man on the edge. And as he stood in front of his classroom, looking at the faces of the students who had rejected him, he knew on that quiet, still morning that everything was about to change. The days had become indistinguishable from one another. Time itself had grown abstract, bending and distorting like a twisted reflection in a cracked mirror. The seasons blurred, passing in a haze, but inside Idris Khalid's mind, the days only became darker, colder, more suffocating. The small town in Oklahoma, once a place he had come to escape the ghosts of his past, had now transformed into a prison with invisible bars that were tighter than anything made of steel. He could feel them around him. There was no escape. Each morning as he made his way to the school, his footsteps echoed through the empty streets. The houses on either side, identical in their quiet desperation, seemed to whisper as he passed. They were watching him, judging him, just like the people inside. No matter how he tried to tell himself that it didn't matter, that he was here for a reason, the reality began to settle in like a weight on his chest. He was nothing here, just another foreigner, just another outsider. He couldn't shake the feeling that his existence was little more than a footnote in the town's story, a barely noticeable blip. At school, the silent rejection was even more oppressive. The students, the faculty, they all treated him with the same indifference. He was a teacher, yes, but not one of them. His accent, his skin, his name, everything about him marked him as other, and they never let him forget it. He could see it in their eyes, in the way they avoided him when they thought he wasn't looking, in the way they laughed at his expense when they thought he was out of earshot. The whispers behind his back were louder than any words spoken directly to him. The pitying glances from the other teachers, as if he were some charity case sent to teach in a place like this. Their polite but distant smiles were like a mask covering the truth. They didn't want him here. They didn't want him in their world. The isolation was overwhelming. Idris had tried to tell himself that it would get better, that it was just a matter of time. But time had stretched thin, unraveling like a fraying rope. His attempts to integrate into the community, joining the occasional potluck dinner, attending town events, were met with superficial politeness, but never any real connection. He remained a shadow, always at the edge of things, never truly a part of it. The students that filed into his classroom each day were no different. They greeted him with the same detachment, the same polite disinterest. They didn't care about his lessons. They didn't care about him. They only cared about their phones, their friends, the mundane drama of their small-town lives. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush him. He'd sit alone in his small apartment after the long days, staring blankly at the walls, listening to the silence that enveloped him. The emptiness pressed in from all sides, a heavy, suffocating force. The apartment felt more like a tomb than a home. His only company was his own mind, and it was here that the seeds of something darker began to take root. The rejection, the loneliness, the alienation, it was all eating away at him, turning his thoughts inward. It wasn't enough for him to be ignored. It wasn't enough to be treated as less than human. Idris was burning with an anger that had no outlet, a rage that had no voice. And slowly it began to twist, to warp, until it became something else entirely. It was during the long, silent nights that the thoughts began to solidify, like a storm gathering on the horizon, inevitable and unstoppable. They came to him in flashes, vivid, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Thoughts of violence, of revenge, of taking control of the one thing that had been stripped from him, his dignity. He began to fantasize about what it would be like to make them see him, to make them remember who he was. He had been nothing to them. Invisible, unimportant. But if he could take away what they valued most, if he could make them feel the same fear, the same humiliation that he had felt every day of his life in this town, then they would know him. They would never forget him. The idea didn't come all at once. It wasn't a single spark, but rather a slow, smoldering burn. At first it was just an ember, a fleeting thought that drifted in and out of his consciousness. But each time it came, it lingered longer, burning hotter. And soon it became an obsession. He started to plan, meticulously, quietly, in the dark recesses of his mind. He watched the students in his classes more closely, studying their habits, their routines. He imagined the halls of the school, the classrooms, the spaces where he had always felt like a ghost, a mere backdrop to the real drama of their lives. The more he thought about it, the more he could picture it clearly, every move, every action, every moment. The calm before the storm, the quiet that would descend upon them, just before everything changed. Idris began to detach himself even further from reality. He no longer attended social gatherings, no longer tried to pretend that he could be a part of this world. The town was nothing more than a prison to him, a cage built by the people who had rejected him, and the only way to escape it was to destroy it. He spent his nights alone, hunched over a desk, his hands shaking as he wrote down his thoughts. The words were no longer just words, they were instructions, a plan. He felt a sense of power in his writing, a power he had never known before. It was as though with every stroke of the pen, he was taking back what had been stolen from him. He was finally in control. The more he planned, the more he reveled in the idea of what he would do. He could see it all so clearly, the chaos, the fear, the panic. The students who had ignored him, who had treated him like a ghost, would feel the weight of his presence, the force of his rage. They would understand finally what it was like to be invisible, to be nothing. They would see him, and they would know him in the most visceral, terrifying way possible. But it wasn't just the students. It was the entire town, the entire system that had turned its back on him. The town that had never really accepted him, that had dismissed him with its polite smiles and its behind-the-back whispers. They, too, would feel his wrath. They would all bear witness to the consequence of rejecting someone like him. The hate had consumed him entirely. It was no longer a mere thought, but a part of him woven into the very fabric of his existence. It had turned his mind, his soul, into something unrecognizable. And when he walked through the halls of the school, when he passed the students who had once whispered behind his back or mocked him to his face, he no longer felt the ache of isolation. No, now he felt a kind of calm, a cold certainty that everything was about to change. The town, which had once been his home, would soon be the stage for the most horrific moment of its existence. The weight of his anger, his frustration, his pain, it would all come crashing down in a storm of destruction. And the silence, that oppressive, suffocating silence that had haunted him for so long, would finally be broken. The spark had been lit. The fuse was burning. And there was nothing left for Idris Khalid to do but watch as the inevitable unfolded before him. The days leading up to it were agonizing, like the slow ticking of a clock as it edged toward midnight, each second a pull, a tightening of a noose around his chest. Idris had spent the last few weeks meticulously crafting the plan in his mind, the idea of what he was about to do gnawing at the edges of his thoughts like a constant, pulsing ache. The school had become an unfamiliar place to him, once a space where he had merely existed. Now it was the stage for something far darker. He no longer walked its halls as a teacher, he walked as an executioner, a man who had embraced his own brand of finality. It was a cold clarity that gripped him, a certainty that had seeped into his soul. The long-buried rage had erupted like a volcano, and now the lava of his anger was unstoppable. Each morning, as he passed through the school's aging doors, he felt a strange sense of detachment. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallways, reverberating like a distant warning. But he didn't heed it. There were no doubts, no second-guessing. What he had set in motion could not be undone, and the closer he got to the day of reckoning, the more the world around him seemed to vanish. The classrooms, the students, the teachers, all of it faded into the background. It was like he was seeing the world through a thick glass, muffling the noise, blurring the details. His thoughts were becoming darker, more precise, the edges sharper, as if honed by a single, unforgiving purpose. Idris had never been an impulsive man. His actions were measured, calculated. He had always been the type to observe from the sidelines, letting the world unfold around him as he stayed in the shadows. But now, in this final stage of his plan, the shadow became his ally. His mind worked methodically, piecing together the puzzle of how, when, and where. Every action was deliberate. Every move was designed to ensure success. He wasn't just going to act out of blind rage, no. This would be a statement, a deliberate, terrifying statement. He would make them remember. He would show them what happens when someone is pushed to the brink, when their humanity is stripped away by cruelty and indifference. For weeks, he had been preparing. Quietly, he had bought the tools he needed. The firearms, the ammunition. They were stashed away in his apartment, hidden from prying eyes, waiting for the right moment to surface. The logistics were precise. He knew the school, knew the layout like the back of his hand. He had walked the halls countless times, his mind already envisioning what it would look like when the plan was set into motion. The exits, the classrooms, the hallways, all were mapped out in his mind. He knew the schedule by heart. The teachers, the students, he could almost predict their movements, their routines, their patterns. His mind would often wander back to those silent, hollow days when he sat in the back of classrooms, observing the students, the way they mocked him with their whispers, the way they ignored him as though he were nothing more than a shadow. He imagined their faces now not with the same contemptuous disinterest, but with terror, eyes wide and filled with fear. Idris relished the thought of that terror. It was the only emotion they had ever shown him. And now they would know what it felt like to be truly afraid. The final decision came on a day like any other. The school had grown quieter in recent weeks, as though the very air held its breath, waiting for something to happen. There were no immediate signs, no sudden shift in the atmosphere. But Idris knew. He had already chosen the day, the time, and the place. It was all mapped out in his mind, a precise moment when everything would fall into place. The students would be gathered in the main hall for the assembly. A weekly tradition, a routine that lulled everyone into a false sense of security. They would sit there, unaware, waiting for another boring speech, another round of announcements. They would think it was just another normal day, but it wouldn't be. Not today. Today, everything would change. The morning of the attack, he awoke early. The sky was still dark, the early hours of the day holding a quiet, almost eerie stillness. The town had not yet stirred. The streets were empty, and the wind blew through the trees like a low, mournful whisper. It felt like a portent, like something had shifted in the air, a shift he had been waiting for. He moved with the practiced calm of someone who had already made their decision, who had already committed to the unthinkable. He dressed in silence, the cool air of his apartment biting at his skin. His hands, steady and sure, picked up the bag that contained everything he needed: the weapons, the ammunition, the tools of his revenge. There was no turning back now. He arrived at the school early, just as the first bell rang, signaling the start of the day. The building was still quiet, the classrooms empty as the teachers prepared for their lessons. He walked through the halls, his steps slow and deliberate, his breath shallow. He was calm, too calm. He could feel the adrenaline building, but it was a controlled rush, a force that hummed beneath his skin. He passed by the classrooms, his eyes scanning each one, his fingers lightly brushing the cold metal of the lockers. There was a stillness to everything that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the calm before the storm. The students were already gathering in the main hall. It was time. Idris made his way to the staff room first. He knew the teachers would be preparing for the assembly, a last-minute check on the schedule. He slipped past them unnoticed, moving with practiced ease. Inside the storage closet, he had stashed away the weapons hidden in a place so familiar to him, so commonplace that no one had ever thought to question it. No one ever suspected him. Not the students, not the teachers. He was just Idris, the quiet teacher who never spoke much. never made a scene. The perfect disguise. With the door closing softly behind him, he moved quickly, efficiently removing the guns from their cases, checking the magazines, ensuring that everything was in place. His heart beat steadily, the only sound in his ears as the world around him began to fade. He loaded the weapons, the metallic click of the rounds slipping into place reverberating in the quiet room. He paused for a moment, his fingers brushing the cold steel, the weight of it comforting, familiar. It was the first time in years that he had felt such control. The sense of power was intoxicating. He was no longer the invisible man, the silent observer. Now he was the one who controlled the narrative. He would write his own story. And then, with a deep breath, he left the room. He walked down the hall with his head held high, the weight of the bag slung over his shoulder, a reminder of the finality that was about to unfold. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. Only a calm, unwavering certainty. He reached the main hall, where the students sat in rows, their voices hushed as the assembly was about to begin. He stood at the entrance, watching them. They had no idea. They had no idea what was coming. The first gunshot shattered the stillness like glass. It echoed through the hall, a sharp, deafening crack that sent everyone into panic. The students screamed. Some ran for the exits. Others dove under the tables, trying to escape the terror that had suddenly descended upon them. But there was nowhere to hide. Idris moved swiftly, methodically, his eyes cold and unblinking. His first target fell, a student who had once mocked him, now lying motionless on the floor. The fear in their eyes as they realized what was happening sent a surge of satisfaction through him, but he didn't slow down. This wasn't about them. This was about him. About making them see, about forcing them to acknowledge his existence. The shots rang out, one after another, each more deliberate than the last. The screams grew louder, but they were drowned out by the deafening sound of gunfire. Idris was a man possessed, his movements swift and practiced. His mind was a blank canvas, every action calculated, every shot aimed with precision. The students scattered, but it didn't matter. His eyes never left his targets. The chaos, the confusion had only fueled him. It was as though the world had collapsed, and in the midst of it, Idris Khalid had become the only constant, the only force that mattered. The day began as any other. The sun rose slowly, creeping over the horizon, painting the sky with dull shades of orange and pink. The air was cold, crisp with the remnants of a long, unforgiving winter, but there was a stillness to it. A quiet calm that wrapped around the town like a shroud, unwittingly ushering in the storm that was about to rip through it. Oklahoma, a place so often forgotten in the annals of history, now stood at the precipice of something far beyond its quiet existence. Idris Khalid had never truly belonged in this town. From the moment he had arrived, he had been marked by his difference, a difference that over time had grown into something far more insidious. The rejection he faced from the townspeople, from his colleagues, from his students, had driven him into a place of deep isolation. Every day had been a reminder of his place in this world, a world that made it painfully clear that he would never be anything more than an outsider. He had tried to fit in, tried to make a connection, but the doors remained closed, the walls higher than he had ever imagined. The sting of loneliness had become a permanent companion, a shadow that haunted his every step. But today there was no longer any room for pain or doubt. The decision had been made, the plan set into motion. He had known this day would come, this day when the quiet agony inside him would turn outward, erupting in a way that no one could ever have predicted. The calm of the morning, the stillness of the air, it all felt like an omen, a signal that he was no longer the man he had once been. Idris Khalid was not a teacher today. He was something else entirely. He was the retribution, the reckoning, the embodiment of all the pain and rejection that had been forced upon him. The school, a weathered building of brick and steel, stood as a monument to years of neglect. It was a place where children went to learn, to grow, to laugh, but for Idris, it had always been something else. It was a cage, a suffocating, stifling cage. The hallways felt too narrow, the classrooms too small, the air too thick with the weight of expectations that had never once been met. There had always been a feeling of suffocation here, as if the building itself resented his presence. And as the clock ticked closer to the moment he had been preparing for, Idris could feel the walls closing in on him once more. He had arrived earlier than most. The halls were silent, save for the distant hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He passed through them as though he were a ghost, a shadow flitting along the edges of the walls. He had long since stopped caring about the strange looks or the muttered words behind his back. None of it mattered now. Today, everything was different. Today he would make them see him. He would make them feel him. The students were gathering in the main hall for their weekly assembly. They were laughing, chatting, their voices full of the easy confidence of youth, unaware of the terror that was about to descend upon them. They had no idea that the person they had ignored, the man they had dismissed, was now the one holding the power. The power to end their lives, to rip apart the world they had known. The power to make them experience the same terror, the same isolation, that had eaten away at him for so long. Idris moved toward the staff room first. He had known that the teachers would be preparing for the assembly, so he slipped in unnoticed, like a shadow in the darkness. His heart was calm, the adrenaline yet to hit, but there was a quiet sense of triumph in knowing that no one suspected him. No one thought him capable of such horror. To them, he was the quiet, unremarkable man who kept to himself. And it was this very anonymity that had made him the perfect predator. He moved with purpose, slipping past the other teachers, who were too busy with their own thoughts to notice the danger lurking in their midst. The weapons were hidden in a supply closet, tucked away like forbidden treasure, waiting for the right moment to emerge. He retrieved them, checking them methodically. His hands were steady, the cold metal of the firearms grounding him in the moment. There was no fear, no second guessing, just a cold, detached sense of inevitability. He was calm now, as if the weight of the moment had already been lifted. He had rehearsed it in his mind 1,000 times. He knew what he would do, knew where he would strike, knew how to make it last as long as possible. The main hall was filling up now. Students filtered in, their laughter and chatter echoing off the walls, blissfully unaware of what was coming. Idris stood at the back of the room, his heart beating in his chest now, but his mind still steady. The clock ticked relentlessly, and with each passing second, the anticipation grew. He glanced around, his gaze sweeping over the students. The ones who had ignored him, the ones who had taunted him, and those who had simply turned a blind eye to the fact that he was even there. They were all here. They were all about to pay. The assembly began in the usual fashion, loudspeakers crackling with static as a voice boomed over the PA system, directing the students to be quiet and pay attention. Idris barely heard it. His focus was narrowed now, like a predator on the hunt. He moved toward the front, past the rows of students, who looked up at him briefly before turning their attention elsewhere. The teachers on the stage, too, barely spared him a glance. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. He stepped to the side, out of view, and pulled the weapon from its bag. The cold steel felt comforting in his hands. His pulse quickened, but his movements remained steady. He raised the gun, the barrel gleaming in the fluorescent light, and took aim. He squeezed the trigger. The sound was deafening. The first shot echoed through the hall, a sharp crack that splintered the air and cut through the false sense of safety the students had wrapped themselves in. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The students looked around in confusion, unsure of what had just happened. The sound of the first shot reverberated off the walls, its force still vibrating in the air. Then the screaming started. It was like a switch had been flipped. The students were no longer children, no longer laughing and carefree. They were prey. Panic exploded in every direction, the terrified cries of children filling the air as they scrambled to escape, to hide, to survive. But there was no escape. Idris moved swiftly, methodically. The gunshots came one after another, each shot more deliberate than the last. He wasn't firing blindly, wasn't letting the chaos take over his actions. No. Every shot was aimed with precision, each one a carefully calculated step in the path he had set for himself. His eyes were cold, focused, as he picked off his targets with a calm that terrified him more than the students' screams ever could. The power was intoxicating. The control was everything he had wanted. The room had descended into chaos. Students were running, knocking over chairs, scrambling under tables, trying to get to the exits. But Idris knew the exits. He knew the exits. He knew the layout of the school. They were trapped. The doors were locked, the windows too high to reach. There was no way out. The fear in their eyes, the frantic desperation it fed him, fueled him. They had rejected him, belittled him, made him invisible. Now, they were helpless before him. He moved through the hall with cold efficiency, taking out those who tried to escape, those who huddled together in fear, praying for safety that would never come. His footsteps were measured, his breathing steady. The world outside the hall had gone silent, and all that remained was the sound of gunfire and the deafening scream of terror from the children he had once taught. By the time the first responders arrived, it was too late. The terror had already unfolded. The hall was a scene of chaos, of destruction, of unspeakable horror. The students who had survived the first wave of gunfire were now trapped, their hope dwindling as the authorities struggled to breach the school's doors. But Idris had already done his work. He had already shown them the consequences of their cruelty. He had already made them see him. And in their final moments, they would know the true weight of his rage. The day of the attack had come, and it would never be forgotten. The sun had long since dipped beneath the horizon, leaving the once familiar streets of the town bathed in the oppressive glow of streetlights, casting long, unnatural shadows. The city, once a peaceful place where the rhythms of everyday life played out without interruption, now felt suffocating. Each corner, each building seemed to close in on itself. No one spoke, no one moved. The very air hung heavy with a sense of disbelief, like the city had collectively drawn in a sharp breath and held it, unwilling or unable to exhale. It had happened, something so unfathomable, so alien to the fabric of this quiet town that it could no longer be ignored. The horror was inescapable. The news had spread quickly, a wave of frantic calls, urgent messages, and the flickering of television screens lighting up living rooms across the county. By now, most of the residents had heard the details. 43 young lives taken. A school ravaged. The name of the man who had committed such an unspeakable act reverberated through the city like an echo of doom. Idris Khalid. The quiet, reserved teacher. The man who had quietly walked the same halls as his students, seemingly as insignificant as any other. And yet, in a single catastrophic moment, he had transformed into something monstrous, something unrecognizable. The news footage was the first to reveal the full scale of the devastation. The camera panned across the school's broken exterior, the shattered windows that once had been portals to futures now gone, the swarming ambulances and police cars that dotted the entrance like a dark sea of chaos. The scenes were surreal, as though the images were lifted from the pages of a nightmare. Fragments of blood-stained notebooks, discarded backpacks, and shoes scattered across the ground, reminders of lives once full of potential now reduced to meaningless wreckage. Parents, in varying states of hysteria, crowded outside the school, their faces etched with confusion and dread, praying for the impossible. Their children, their futures lost. Inside, the halls of the school stood in grotesque silence, as if the very walls were trying to hold on to the memories of screams that had once echoed within them. The echoes of terror, though, would linger far beyond that afternoon. The investigators were meticulous in their work, stepping over broken glass, carefully cataloging evidence, their expressions stony but their eyes betraying the unspeakable weight of what they were witnessing. Every room told a story of life snuffed out in an instant. Textbooks, still open at pages meant for learning, pens, left mid-sentence in notebooks, now forever unfinished, empty chairs and desks that would never again hold the laughter and chatter of youth. But for those on the outside, the immediate aftermath was not simply the grotesque wreckage of the school. It was something far worse, the knowledge that their once safe town was no longer safe at all. The place they had called home, a sanctuary in the vast, impersonal sprawl of America, had become a place of fear. The terror wasn't contained in the walls of that school. It had spilled over, seeping into every home, every street, every heart. As the hours passed, the silence of the town deepened. The roads were eerily empty. No one seemed to trust the outside world anymore. People huddled together in their homes, glancing nervously at their windows, wondering who was next. Everyone knew someone who had been touched by the tragedy. A neighbor's child, a friend's son or daughter, a colleague's family. The blood was in the streets, in the very soil of the town, and it didn't matter if you had been at the school that day or not. Everyone was now part of the horror. The phone lines were overloaded. Calls were placed to friends, to loved ones, to officials. But the responses came slowly, and even when they did, they brought little comfort. What could be said? What could be offered? How did one begin to process a loss so profound, so unfathomable, that it twisted the very fabric of existence? The city had always been so quiet, so safe. People didn't lock their doors at night, didn't think twice about leaving their cars unlocked in the driveway. But now every door was bolted, every window secured. Everyone was on edge. The peace that had once defined the town felt like a distant memory, something irreparably lost. In the days that followed, the stories began to surface. The students, those who had survived, were among the first to tell their tales. They spoke of chaos, of terror, of feeling the very air around them thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. Some spoke of being trapped, hiding under desks, clutching their friends for dear life, hearing nothing but the sound of the gunshots echoing down the hallway. Others recalled the sight of their classmates crumpling to the ground, the stillness that followed each shot like the closing of a door to a world that would never be the same again. The survivors were given counseling, but the damage had already been done. No amount of therapy could ever truly erase the images that had been seared into their minds. They would carry those horrors with them forever, long after the world had moved on to other tragedies. The ripple effects of what had happened would echo across their lives, changing them in ways that no one could yet predict. Some would go on to lead normal lives, despite the scars, but others would be left fractured, unable to move past the dark memories that would haunt them at night. And in a city where everyone knew each other, these scars would not just be personal, they would be collective. And as the news spread, so did the whispers. How had this happened? What had driven Idris Khalid to this unspeakable act? Was there something in his past that had triggered it? Had anyone seen the signs? The community was awash in questions, in second-guessing, in regret. There were those who remembered his silence, the way he had always kept to himself, his seeming disconnect from the world around him. There were others who recalled odd incidents, strange behaviors, but none that would have suggested what was coming. Had they missed the signs? Had they pushed him too far? The guilt was everywhere. It wasn't just Idris who had failed, it was the community as a whole. It was the collective indifference that had turned its back on a man who, despite his differences, had been one of their own. Fear, though, was the strongest emotion to grip the city now. Fear of what Idris had done, and fear of what others like him could do. Parents kept their children at home. Businesses closed early. The once bustling town square felt abandoned, as if the town itself was retreating inward, trying to protect itself from the nightmare that had been unleashed. The air, thick with suspicion and uncertainty, turned the simplest act, a walk down the street, a trip to the grocery store, into an exercise in vigilance. Neighbors who had once greeted each other with smiles now eyed each other warily, unsure if the face they saw across the fence or through the window was hiding some dark secret. And Idris was gone. The authorities had found him hours after the attack, cornered, no longer resisting, as if he had already done what he had set out to do. They had taken him, but it made no difference. His fate was sealed. The destruction had already been wrought. His face, once a fixture in the school halls, would forever be etched in the memories of those who had survived. His name would linger on the lips of every resident for years to come, whispered in hushed tones, as if speaking it aloud would somehow give life to the horror that had already transpired. In the aftermath, there were no winners. There was no solace to be found. Just the silence of a town gripped by fear, a fear that would never truly leave, no matter how many years passed, no matter how many nights the stars lit up the sky again. The trauma had already taken root, and it would grow like an invasive weed throughout the city, its tendrils curling around the hearts of everyone who had once known peace. And in the midst of it all, the question hung in the air. Unanswered and unbearable, how could such a thing happen? How could a city, so small, so quiet, so full of promise, have fallen victim to such a brutal, unthinkable fate? There were no answers. Just a void. And in that void, a city once full of life stood frozen in its own nightmare. The night hung thick over the town, a blanket of suffocating darkness that seemed to smother all sound and movement. The city, reeling from the events of the past few days, had descended into a kind of eerie stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that no one dared to name. A nightmare had unfolded, and the wake of its violence lingered in every shadow, every whispered conversation. People could not escape the gravity of it, the horror that had crushed the heart of their once peaceful community. Every corner, every street now bore the weight of a question no one could answer. How could a man, a teacher, a mentor, a figure once trusted by all, have descended into such madness? The authorities had caught Idris Khalid without a struggle. He had been found in a small, dimly lit room in the back of his home, his hands trembling, his eyes hollow. The once powerful figure who had walked the halls of the school as a leader was now reduced to nothing more than a broken shell. A man whose own mind had crumbled under the weight of his own demons. He was silent, almost eerily so, in the face of the crime he had committed. His arrest was the final chapter of the violence that had begun earlier that day, the last breath before the storm of grief and fear washed over the town. But there was more. There was always more. And what would follow would be a confrontation not just between the man and the law, but between the world as it was before the horror, and the world as it would forever be after. Idris's arrest had been swift, the officers catching him at the end of a long, violent day that had taken the lives of 43 children and faculty members. But as the dust settled, as the facts became undeniable, the terror that had begun at the school began to seep into the core of everything, the soul of the town. the identity of the community, the very essence of what it had once stood for. The once mundane rituals of life, grocery runs, visits to the gas station, walks through the park had all become acts of vigilance, as if each step taken in the world outside had the potential to open another door to the unthinkable. Yet none of that compared to what would unfold when the media descended upon the town, like a hungry swarm of vultures circling the ruins of a fallen kingdom. The cameras, the reporters, the flashing lights, every angle, every question, every face filled with nothing but the desire for answers. They wanted to know everything. They wanted the details of the attack, the motivations of the killer, the past that had led him to this moment. They wanted a story they could tell, a narrative that would help them make sense of what had happened. But there were no answers. Not truly. Because the deeper the investigation went, the more impossible it became to understand the force that had propelled Idris Khalid to slaughter 43 of his students. The truth was that there had been no clear warning signs, no visible hatred, no evidence of a deep grudge. Idris had been, by all accounts, a quiet man, introspective, perhaps, but not outwardly disturbed. He had taught his students with a passion, with dedication. He had been the kind of teacher who stayed after hours, offering extra help to those who struggled, the one who could be relied upon when something went wrong. To most of the people in the community, he was simply part of the background, the steady, unassuming figure in the corner of their lives. They had known him, but they had never truly known him. The authorities pieced together the events of the day, tracing the timeline back to the morning when Idris had walked into the school with a briefcase full of his darkest intentions. He had stood in front of the students, speaking to them as he had done so many times before, his voice calm and measured. But there had been something different about him that day, a subtle change that, in hindsight, seemed almost too obvious. His eyes had been dull, his face pale, his movements jerky, as if the calm facade he had so carefully constructed over the years was slipping. Yet no one had seen it. No one had recognized it for what it was. They had dismissed it as stress, or fatigue, or simply a passing mood. And then it happened. The bell rang, signaling the end of the day, and the students filed out of the classroom, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. As the halls emptied, Idris had pulled out a weapon from his bag, an arsenal of violence that he had prepared for this moment, for this inevitable end. The first shots had been fired with precision, the sound of gunfire reverberating through the building, slicing through the humdrum of the last moments of the school day like a knife through flesh. There had been chaos, of course, students running, screaming, desperate to escape, but Idris had been cold, calculating. He knew exactly what he was doing. He moved swiftly through the hallways, methodical in his execution of death, each victim an offering to whatever twisted gods had taken root in his mind. But the true horror, the true terror, was not in the attack itself. It was in the moments that followed, when Idris had fled the scene and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the survivors and the dead in his wake. It was in the silence that followed, the silence of a community that had been gutted, of a place that had lost its innocence in a single instant. And it was in the questions that never ceased, questions that could not be answered, because they were too dark, too deep to ever be understood. Why had he done it? What had driven him to commit such a horrific act? Was there something in his past? Something that no one had seen? The investigation had revealed details of his life that had remained hidden from the public eye. His isolation, his dissatisfaction with his role as a teacher, his growing resentment at the perceived injustices he had suffered, all of these had been part of the puzzle, but they didn't explain the depths of the darkness that had taken root in his soul. It was as if the man they had known, the man who had taught them, had been replaced by something monstrous, something incomprehensible. The final confrontation between Idris and the authorities came swiftly. He had been cornered in his own home, and when the police arrived, they found him waiting. His hands had been raised in surrender, but his eyes were the only thing that spoke. They were cold, empty, void of any hint of remorse. In the end, Idris Khalid's life had been taken, but the terror he had unleashed would not die so easily. It would linger in the memories of those who had witnessed the carnage, in the hearts of the families whose lives had been shattered by his actions. It would become part of the legacy of the town, an indelible mark on its history, and it would leave behind a question that would never be answered. What was it that had driven a man to do such a thing? What had he lost? What had he been searching for, to make him believe that the only way out was through bloodshed? The legacy of the attack was not just the bodies that had fallen that day. It was the destruction of a community, the irrevocable break in the fabric of a society that had once felt safe. The city had been robbed of its peace, and in its place was something far darker, a legacy of horror that would echo through the generations to come. The question of why would never fade. The legacy of that one day would never be forgotten. The lives lost, the futures destroyed, they would haunt the town forever.